Good morning, everyone, from cold, bright, sunny, blue Beijing. Welcome to this special webcast of the Conference Board of Asia. I know we have a number of members of ours who are joining us today, as well as a number of guests. Welcome, members, and welcome guests. Today we're featuring a special webcast from our rich and multifaceted TCB Conference Board of Asia program that includes council programs, human capital related programs, and a China Center program that emanates from our China Center for Economics and Business in Beijing, where we study critical events and developments for multinationals operating in China or engaging with Chinese competitors or partners globally. The topic today will be familiar to everyone, the U.S.-China trade conflict or trade war, as it's often referred to now. We're going to take you through some key points that hopefully shape your thinking on the topic and inform your strategic and business planning. At the end of the day, probably the most important takeaway from all this is that now geostrategic planning, scenario planning, and game planning now must factor into your China strategy and business planning. And hopefully today's presentation informs your thinking on that. My name is David Hoffman. I'm based in Asia. I lead the Conference Board of Asia here in the region. I'm joined today by my colleague Ethan Kramer-Flood in New York, who is an associate director of our China program, and in particular focuses on geostrategic and geopolitical issues related to China and the world, not just China and the United States, but globally. So topics like Belt and Road and so forth. We're going to jump right into the material and try to take you through this as quickly as possible. Just a few remarks on housekeeping. You can ask questions in the dialog box on the bottom left of the screen. You can also download today's presentation at your leisure. And if CPE credits are relevant to you, if you're joining us from the United States or if you're American, there's a box there that you can fill in your name and details to receive CPE credits for listening in today. Our emails are listed here, so if we don't get to your questions today, please reach out to Ethan or me directly at your convenience. Members, you know that you can always get in-company briefings with us, either via video conference or in person if logistics work out. So let's just jump right in, and I'll hand over to Ethan.
Thanks very much, David, and hello everyone from New York City. It is 8 o'clock at night the day before for all of you who are watching here, but I am very happy to be joining you to provide the perspective from the U.S., from Conference Board headquarters on the U.S.-China trade conflict, which is my area of specialty within the China Center, the Conference Board's China Center, as David referenced earlier. So this opening slide here describes for all of you a bit of an agenda or the key premises that we are going to walk through throughout the course of the next, say, 40 or 45 minutes. We'll try very hard to get you all out of here in less than an hour. I am going to spend just a few minutes focusing mainly on point one. I'll walk you through the rest of it now. You know, we have some perspective on the Trump administration's particular viewpoints in the way that the U.S. side is prosecuting this trade confrontation. We'll talk a little bit about that. We are going to spend a heck of a lot of time talking to you all about the way that this confrontation is morphing well beyond simply a traditional tariff-based tit-for-tat trade war into what has been called a technology Cold War, and how we think that there's been a distinct diversion in the direction of that confrontation, which is point three. And of course, point four, towards the end, we will give you our assessment on how we think everything is going and how we think it is going to play out in the near, medium, and longer term. But if you'll bear with me just for, say, 3 to 4 minutes, I do want to focus on point one here, which describes a bit of the historical context of how the two sides got to this place that we're in now. Because if we are all business planners and strategists, and our mission in thinking about these issues is to try to best sort of understand what is happening, how bad it is, and it is going to get, how long it's going to last, and what we can expect in terms of a resolution or lack thereof, then it does help for us to inform our thinking by just spending a little bit of time to understand how we all got here, because it's really the drivers and the motivations that led to this confrontation are still driving both sides, even as they negotiate today, and they will continue to sort of drive the policy-making decisions that will play out and impact businesses like all of yours. So point one, the change in status quo is permanent. That's what we've highlighted here, and that's a really important takeaway for everyone listening. The argument that we would make is that although, of course, the election of Donald Trump, the surprise election of Donald Trump on the US side has perhaps exacerbated or accelerated or inflamed the nature of the confrontation that we're here to talk about, we would argue that a pivot point had already been reached between China and its advanced economy trading partners, particularly the United States, even before the election, and that a change in the dynamic of the way in which the US and the other Western economies think about their economic relationship with China had already occurred, and that this path towards confrontation was basically inevitable, to the point where I even often say when I'm having these conversations that even had Hillary Clinton been elected president in 2016 in the US, there's a pretty good chance that all of us would still be together today talking about this exact same topic, because something like this would have happened anyway. The reason for that is that an era of what we've called strategic patience on the part of China's business and economic trading partners had really come to a close. There was a long stretch of time after China acceded to the World Trade Organization, wherein the rest of the wealthy economies, advanced economies, US and Europe, et cetera, Australia, Japan, treated China differently. There were special dispensations. There was an understanding that China was a different kind of country, a different kind of economy. Everyone was in favor of China joining the World Trade Center, you may recall, the World Trade Organization, you may recall. And at the time, there was a sense that although China was not going to be able to necessarily be entirely compliant with the rules and obligations of the WTO and the way that the US and Europe tried to be, that was okay, because China was amidst an exciting reform and opening period. It was growing. It was in the midst of a growth miracle. There was genuine win-win outcomes to be had, even though the playing field inside China was clearly unlevel. It was clearly not a market economy in the way that other WTO participants were. But that's okay. And there was this era of patience, whereas as long as China was continuing on a path towards openness and leveling and moving towards the kind of free market economy that the US uses for its economic governance system, then there was going to be a sort of acceptance of the fact that China was going to be treated differently for a little while. That era really came to a dramatic and spectacular close within the last few years, and as I've said before, arguably even before Donald Trump came on the scene. This shift from patience with China's different way of conducting its economic governance and trade relationships can be highlighted in two or three main changes that led to this difference. On the one hand, you had China's own spectacular emergence as a global economic power and the emergence of its national champion companies as dominant outbound FDI players, specifically in the M&A space, where suddenly, maybe you were all familiar with this storyline from the last couple of years, China went from being a negligible source of global FDI to being maybe number one, certainly the number one source of outbound M&A, and Chinese companies began to exercise and take advantage of free market openness in the rest of the world, buying up national champion companies in Germany and the US and the UK and Australia, and generally enjoying the principles that create a level playing field in those other markets, wherein foreign MNCs are not able to enjoy that kind of openness in their business activities inside China. That had a light bulb effect for foreign diplomats who said, wait a minute, the fact that China's own domestic economy does not treat our MNCs fairly inside China suddenly matters a whole heck of a lot more now that China's companies are becoming dominant players in our marketplaces. While this was happening, China came out with a program called Made in China 2025 that they perhaps unfortunately diplomatically shouted from the rooftops, and this industrial policy, along with a range of other policies that you all may be familiar with, sort of alerted the rest of the world to what could be described as techno-nationalist intentions and was perceived as extremely threatening, particularly by the United States, given that Made in China 2025 lays out an intention to dominate in industries and sectors that the US considers very, very important for its future prosperity and national security. So those changes are what got us to where we are now. And it's equally important to highlight that along with that, that thought process in the US, you have a shared similar thought process in Berlin and Brussels and London and Canberra, et cetera, where many, if not all, of China's advanced economy trading partners are all at the same time sort of becoming nervous and becoming aware of this challenge. And they're all sort of retaliating and replying at the same time. We are going to focus on the US side of it, but it's important to keep in mind this is a global phenomenon. My second slide here just quickly describes for you what you would be aware of if you've been following the news over the last year. I won't go into it, but this is just a recap of the way in which this confrontation did begin with traditional sort of trade-based tariffs and tit-for-tat retaliation becoming increasingly more severe to the point that it really became impactful for supply chains and for bottom lines, as anyone watching this probably knows. Let me focus here. As you see, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 is sort of increasing the dollar figures on the confrontation. But Act 4, I think, is what we're going to spend a good amount of time focusing on here, because the technology element of this confrontation really has come to the forefront, and it's important for anyone listening to this to understand that these storylines can and will go in different directions. It does look like we have a Trumpian phenomenon with the way in which the tit-for-tat tariff confrontation is playing out. And we have a maybe not a lot of mainstream political or economic thinking in support of the use of tariffs. There's a lot of complaints. There's a lot of pushback. Everyone on Wall Street in the business community sort of hopes that this comes to a conclusion. And therefore, those of us that are in the business world watching it all play out can maybe anticipate that it's somehow, some way, that element will be resolved. But we really have to focus and understand that the technology Cold War that has emerged simultaneously, as described in this slide, is not going to go away. This is the real front line. You have tremendous bipartisan support in Washington, D.C. for the kind of policy changes that have been implemented to sort of bifurcate the U.S. and China technology space. This Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act that is bolded here, that has dramatically ramped up the scope of CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., their responsibilities and their authority to restrict Chinese technology investment in the U.S., and concurrently the Export Control Act of 2018 that restricts Chinese access to American technology exports. These passed by wide margins. Both political parties in the U.S. agree on this. These changes are not going to go away. This is especially what we mean when we say that the status quo is changed permanently, and that although the Trump administration has created some unexpected outcomes, everyone sort of listening to this needs to understand that the tech space element is these changes, and the way in which the walls are coming up is very likely to be permanent. I'm going to hand it back to David in just a minute to walk us through some of our thinking on both the insider sort of information on what we're hearing from Washington, D.C., and what we think this all means for business. But many of you listening are aware that there is we're in the midst of a negotiating period right now, a sort of 90-day window or pause on the acceleration of the confrontation. There has been some optimism that we may come to some sort of resolution on parts of this confrontation on the tariff element. I personally remain skeptical. but it's possible there could be good news in the coming weeks, even if the March 1st deadline is extended. We'll talk a little bit about this more later. But mainly, the reason for optimism is that pressure has mounted on both sides so substantially. You all are probably feeling China's economic slowdown. In the US, the circumstances have changed already. In 2018, the Trump administration was operating from a position of incredible economic strength. That has changed considerably with the reaction of Wall Street and general sort of uncertainty about the US sort of strength of the economy going forward. So this is why we think on some elements there may be some optimism, but on the technology space there is not optimism, actually things are getting worse, or at least things are becoming more extreme every day. David, let me toss it back to you to tell us what you've heard from some of your sources on the DC side.
Thanks, Ethan. Ethan, what we do our best to keep on top of the news flow and feed from the various sources we have in China and around the world on this matter. And it's important to contextualize this data. Ethan mentioned that this is the hard stance on China has broad bipartisan support. It goes very deep. He didn't touch on the reform of the CFIUS bill or the CFIUS committee, the Committee for Inward Investment in the United States, and the establishment of FIRMA, the Foreign Inward Risk Review Modernization Act, that will permit the U.S. government to not only review incoming investment in the United States vis-a-vis national security concerns. It broadens the scope of national security to include intellectual property and economic security, so not just defense and weaponry and critical infrastructure and so forth. It also extends the long arm of CFIUS via FIRMA to oversee the activity of American multinationals in China or foreign multinationals that have substantial U.S. presence to review cases where critical intellectual property is being put at risk of leakage vis-a-vis unique commercial arrangements or partnerships or other types of structures in China. So I want to return to that a little bit at the end. Several things we're hearing are worth thinking about. First, that there is very strong unity on this issue in the United States, not just at the White House and the houses of Congress or the larger analyst community in Washington, but also the broader polity, both sides of the electorate, and broadly among the business community as well. So we're looking at a very unified platform, if you will, that wishes to see a level playing field, reciprocal trade and investment arrangements, and fair competition. Business, based on our conversations with members and business leaders around the world, would like more engagement, more clarity on policy directions, more consistency on policy rhetoric, and so forth. That certainly is true. There's been a lot of concern about the impacts of the tariff regime on the agricultural sector that has been hard hit. Our understanding is that U.S. negotiators are not very concerned about this impact. They view it as short term. They believe that U.S. agriculture is globally competitive, that it may suffer some pain in the near term, but it won't lose its global competitiveness because of this trade war, whether it's in the near term or longer term. The focus is on manufacturing. The idea being that this hard stance on China needs to restore a level playing field in the manufacturing space and ideally, if the White House agenda is to be believed, to bring manufacturing jobs or create more manufacturing jobs in the United States. Multilateralism is also a hot topic. Why doesn't the U.S. engage more with its allies globally in multilateral blocs to put pressure on China? Our understanding is that the desire on the Hill is that U.S. allies pick a side, and it's as simple as that. Something that happened very quietly that many are unaware of is that when Jeff Sessions, the former U.S. Attorney General, departed the administration, he put forth an initiative called the China Initiative, which essentially mobilized U.S. enforcement agencies across all sectors to prioritize, elevate, and prosecute their Chinese grievances or Chinese cases, and in particular, those that relate to trade, levelness, level playing field, and IP protection. The Huawei case would certainly fall under this rubric. So would the Fujian Jinhua indictment. ZTE was the first. Our understanding is this won't end with Huawei. That's just the beginning, that there are many more cases in the docket that we should expect to be forthcoming soon. And one of the things we're thinking a lot about is, how these cases against Chinese executives and enterprises will factor into the longer-term U.S.-China relationship. We're all looking now for pointers from the Huawei case to try to read the tea leaves in this regard. Finally, the notion that the administration might blink, settle for a minimal deal, and that the hard stance will go away is something that we don't think is a safe assumption. To Ethan's previous point, there's a lot of support for a hard China stance, not just among the business community, but certainly within the military-industrial complex. And even if the administration blinks or changes, we expect this pressure to remain, if not intensify. One of the things we've been thinking a lot about is underneath it all, what is this about? And this is a rather simplified slide, but probably is the most important of all things to think about. And that's whether this is about fair competition and conformance, i.e. that China begin to conform with global norms, or at least U.S. and European norms for trade and investment, rule of law, IP protection, and so forth, competitive competition policy and the safeguards on it, and the restrictions of monopoly powers and so forth, or whether this is about geostrategic containment and isolation. There is a very vocal contingent who see China as a strategic long-term threat that needs to be countered, that needs to be contained and isolated. If it's the former, about fair competition and conformance, there is a lot that can be done policy-wise, and I'm going to come back to that at the end. If it's about geostrategic containment and isolation, then this all gets very murky and difficult. And you have to ask this question from two sides. You need to ask it about whether the U.S. side believes it's one or the other, and you have to ask whether the China side believes it's one or the other. These questions are very hard to answer. Our view would be that generally on the U.S. side, with rare exception, it is about fair competition and conformance, a level playing field. There are certainly some who believe that it's about geostrategic containment and isolation, and these include some from the military hawks, but others in the administration and on the Hill speak about China and the Thucydides trap and the rise of a new power and the collision with a great power and all of that is certainly prominent in the media. But we believe overall that for both sides, it's about fair competition and conformance, although China's understanding of this issue, what fair competition means, may be very different from ours even now. That said, I think it's safe to assume that there's a fair number of powerful people here in China who believe that the U.S. has nefarious intentions with respect to containing China. And this is what makes it very difficult. Hopefully, U.S. negotiators do whatever is possible to convince their Chinese counterparts that it's about fair competition and conformance and not about containment of China. Ethan had mentioned that the two sides are very far apart. And this really relates to the notion of fair competition and conformance and the paradox that creates regarding bringing manufacturing jobs and investment back to the United States. Primarily, the White House, at least, wants to bring manufacturing jobs back. And in the infamous or famous Navarro-Ross white paper from summer 2016, there was critique of American multinationals who went to China to exploit cheap labor and factor inputs, leaving Mr. and Mrs. America behind, that they should never have gone there in the first place. So if we imagine a scenario where China does agree to level playing field issues, to IP protection, to a withdrawal of subsidies, to support national champions and state-owned enterprises and so forth, all of the things the U.S. business community and the business community in Europe and elsewhere has been asking for years, that would, without question, encourage U.S. companies to invest even more in China. And it's hard to square that problem. If China concedes to what U.S. business wants, it doesn't solve the problem of creating more manufacturing investment in the United States. There may be some aspects to this that can satisfy that objective. For example, Chinese firms investing greenfield in manufacturing in the United States. There are some very interesting cases in this regard. China is one of China's largest auto parts company. A maker of windshields and bumper fixtures called Fuyao did such an investment in Ohio, and it has been very well received. So again, Chinese greenfield investment in manufacturing in the United States versus acquisition of American companies, could potentially be one way to square this circle. Ethan, I think you're going to run us through the scenarios here.
Thanks, David. So as we go around the world talking to conference board member companies and China Center member companies about this issue, inevitably at some point during the course of the discussion, executives will raise their hand and say, okay, this is all very interesting, but what's going to happen? Tell us, what do you think is going to happen? And of course, that's the worst question to get because, spoiler alert, we don't know what is going to happen. So I'm not going to, David and I would not presume to simply declare for you some sort of certainty as to how this is all going to turn out so that you can then immediately input that into your business planning decisions. But we think we have come up with a framework here that sort of clarifies the range of possible thinking and what is plausible versus what is not plausible. And that's these three scenarios that we actually we put together last year, even as things were really, really intensifying. And I think that these three scenarios still pretty much encapsulate the range of possible outcomes. And every morning I wake up and I have a different opinion about which one of them is likely to be right. But I think that this can help us sort of take into account the possible outcomes that we need to be prepared for supply chain issues for our businesses in general. So scenario one was, this remains absolutely on the table. We're calling it China concedes. That might be a strong word, but it involves a resolution to the confrontation that could, by some, be described as the U.S., quote unquote, winning in as much as China comes to the negotiating table, and you can envision a scenario where the leadership from Beijing says, okay, enough. These Americans are causing too many problems, and China's economy is fragile at the moment, and we have a lot of other issues more pressing to deal with, and this is simply not the right point in history to be engaged in a full frontal economic confrontation with the biggest economy in the history of the world. Okay, Americans, we will back down in some respects. We will give you a heck of a lot of what you want, at least from us as outside observers, maybe more than we ever would have thought China would offer in the form of concession. And this scenario would need to have played out by quite a long-term, consistent pressure tactic on the part of the U.S. side, which has played out to some degree. It has been a while now, almost a year, and they are not backing off yet. So this scenario would simply involve something that the Trump administration would probably legitimately be able to call a win, and by the way, would involve considerable good news for multinational companies operating in China, and frankly, would probably involve quite a bit of good news for Chinese private companies operating in China. For the most part, they would as well benefit from the kind of reforms that would be part of this kind of dramatic package of China agreeing to genuinely restructure its economy. Scenario 2 was a hot option towards the end of last year. It essentially describes a scenario wherein hawks on both sides of the Pacific get what they want, which is to turn this confrontation into an excuse for a longer-term, more permanent decoupling of the two economies, an unwinding of globalization. On the U.S. side, David referenced, this desire to reshore manufacturing, to unwind the expansion of U.S. multinational companies' supply chains into China. There are those, we believe in the minority, but there are those inside the Beltway and D.C. and beyond who would be interested in creating a scenario where the current tariff regime and the current tension and confrontation would simply become the new status quo, and that those tariffs would remain in place for however long it takes for supply chains to leave China and for American companies to get this message. And on the China hawk side, you do have some voices as well, although they are probably an extreme minority. They would be in favor of this decoupling as well. Scenario 3, this has become more reasonable and more plausible, or if not probable, given the tremendous vacillations and fluctuations in the stock market in New York that we saw in December and last month, a lot of which, the Fed decision-making had a lot to do with that, and extra numbers had a lot to do with that, but China had a lot to do with that. Particularly the ebb and flow of news on the state of the trade war seems on a daily basis to influence the markets. We believe that in Washington, D.C. and the White House, they're very sensitive to these gyrations. They're sensitive to predictions that the U.S. economy will not be as strong this year. That then puts on the table the idea that the American side might decide that they're tired of this confrontation, and that reopens the possibility of withdrawing some of the most extreme demands on the China side, creating a new negotiating environment wherein it's more possible for China to come to the table and say, okay, maybe we can find a reasonable, moderated settlement that does not involve any sort of genuinely structurally revolutionary changes on the China side. We would anticipate if this does come about, that both sides would claim victory, even if the U.S. side does not get everything from the China side that it claims it will be necessary. We are now in this 90-day window, and I promised all of you we would get back to it, and we will, because these scenarios beg the question of what direction are we heading in now that we're on the midst of this 90-day pause. And just for those who maybe haven't been following the day-to-day news, the negotiations have been very intensive. There was a big China delegation in D.C. a couple of weeks ago. The Americans then went back to Beijing last week. The Chinese side is, I believe, already here again in Washington, D.C. this week, and this is up to the ministerial level. Liu He and team on the China side, and Robert Lighthizer, who is the key decision maker as the U.S. trade representative on the U.S. side, with the Secretary of the Treasury and Commerce in tow. So the conversation has I guess the extensiveness of these interactions has generated some degree of optimism. But what I want to emphasize for all of you and what this slide shows is that we need to remember that there are two different storylines playing out. The unified perspective in DC to get tough on China remains in place on this right side of this slide, which is all about technology. Let me emphasize again, although there are negotiations happening in DC right now, and although there is a chance that some sort of very happy resolution will emerge on March 1st or after a brief extension, the technology issues that we've been talking about for the last half hour are not even on the table. So there is nothing being negotiated that would unwind the indictments on Huawei, for instance. There is nothing being negotiated that would unwind the Justice Department's new China initiative. There is nothing on the table to reverse the changes to CFIUS or the Export Control Act or the way in which the political leaders in DC and frankly Berlin and the UK as well, et cetera, are intending to restrict China's access and the ability for the most advanced technology companies on the US side to have the kind of cooperation, joint venture, mutual R&D, et cetera, with their Chinese partners that they've had in the past. These storylines are not going to change. That's not even on the table. What is on the table is some sort of resolution to the tariff crisis, which will still be welcome, certainly. I again, am skeptical that they'll be able to resolve all of this in such a short period of time. I'm skeptical that China will be able to fulfill whatever promises that they make. However, it might work out. I think both sides have a great deal of motivation to get some of this to go away and then reap the rewards from business confidence and from the markets as well. So there's optimism on tariffs. There's pessimism on the Cold War, on the technology Cold War. And so when you all go back to your desks and begin to monitor the news over the next 9 days to see if there's a result before March 1st, and maybe it's a month from now, right? They can extend it arbitrarily. The March 1st deadline is arbitrary. It can be extended, no problem. But at some point, there's going to be a deadline. Watch for the results. If there is a negotiated settlement, be aware that it's going to be something more like on the left side, and it's not going to be on the right side. And so for business planning contingencies, the right side is going to remain with us. So moving forward now, sort of in our assumptions for all of you as what to take away from this presentation and this sort of information download and some prognostications. I'll just reemphasize that we have this very strong likelihood of a bifurcated technology space between the US and China that matters a lot, obviously, for tech companies that are right in the hot glare of attention from both governments right now, but it's going to matter for anyone with sensitive IP. There is a wide range of products and sectors and industries that are slowly coming out and being described in the Export Controls Act. This is not going to go away. And then also with regard to any potential resolution or announcement at the end of this 90-day period, again, we are suspicious. I would immediately be suspicious of any deal that doesn't seem like a genuinely grand bargain to resolve the complaints that are animating the U.S. side. If the issues on IP theft are not taken care of, if the issues on subsidies of state-owned enterprises are not addressed, and especially with regard to this White House, if it doesn't seem like there's a realistic path towards addressing the very, very severe trade imbalance, then I'm not sure that whatever comes out of this is going to last. So keep an eye out for how significant the deal seems to be. If it seems to be kicking the can down the road, if it seems to be a small deal, I would expect the tensions are going to inflame. David, please.
Just jumping in here, Ethan. The box on the right is something we'd like to spend a little bit of time on and then make some closing remarks. Again, assuming that on the US side and the European side, this is about fair and level competition. What could fundamentally be done that would change the environment that has now lasted for roughly 40 years, i.e. the unlevel playing field. And number one in this list on the right is really the most important and something we study very deeply, the nature of regulatory behavior and regulatory engagement in China. And multinationals, the primary problem they have is that they operate in China on the basis of a business license that enumerates what they're permitted to do in a positive list construct. So your business license may have 20 items or 30 items and describe what you're authorized to do. The problem is that as industries evolve and technologies evolve and markets change, new items come up. And you need to engage then with the Chinese regulators, who then have complete discretion and power and influence over your destiny. And almost always the case is that the regulators contain your position. This is why multinationals have found the China environment so treacherous, never know whether they're compliant or not, and are able to build a successful business in one area, but see that tamped down and contained over time. And we would even go so far as to argue that the multinational presence in China has been one that has always been defined as contained, transitional, and parameterized. If this was changed to a negative list construct, insofar as a multinational was given a business license to say, except for ABC, you are permitted to do anything else unconditionally and unconstrained. This is the way things operate in the United States. This is the way they operate in Europe. This would clear so many, many problems. We know that on the U.S. side, there is a list of 142 items the U.S. side is asking for. No one I've met has ever seen that list or has access to it. We hope that they're asking for this number one. Other things where significant progress could be made would be around IP infringement, penalties. The IP environment has actually become more professionalized and hospitable here in China. The problem is the fines are too low. They need to be raised to world standard. That would provide a significant deterrent, even if enforcement doesn't improve. We've seen this occur in Taiwan and Singapore and Japan and elsewhere. It's a must-do. The third point is around sensible data and ownership rights. As some of you may know, China has introduced and promulgated a cybersecurity law. It's even more strict than the European GDPR data and privacy protections. There's no reason why U.S. or foreign companies should have to put their data assets under Chinese legal control, i.e., in an entity owned and operated by a potential Chinese competitor. They should be forced to operate with the same privacy protection measures, compliance requirements, and so forth. But again, exposing the data to potential leakage through an ownership structure is, again, an example of this negative list problem. There's also a lot of talk on the U.S. side about verification and enforcement mechanisms. It's something we've been thinking a lot about. Ultimately, we think that Western firms are going to have some platform for discussing the actual challenges they face in China with regulators, their regulators, so that U.S. government officials or European government officials understand the non-tariff barriers and the pressures on IP leakages that these companies face in China. This seminal white paper published by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in 2014 on how China was using its anti-monopoly law to promote industrial policy was seminal and breakthrough in that it revealed how collective bargaining was being used against U.S. IP licensees to force down royalty pricing and so forth. And that informed Washington like no other study had done before. So if we want enforcement on these issues, there's got to be a mechanism for foreign companies to reveal the actual pressures, the unlevelness they face here in China, because without that, government enforcers will never know.
So,
now, I'd like
David,
to end on
David, can I interrupt?
Yes?
Before you take us home with this final slide here, there's a question here that I think there's a good time to slide in before you transition to our conclusion. We had a question on what are the likely on the U.S. side of the negotiating table, what are the likely pressure points that they are asking for with regard to state-owned enterprises? And I think this is actually a useful question because it does impact really what they may or may, what the U.S. side may or may not be able to extract on SOEs has major implications for anyone doing business in China, whether it's an MNC or a Chinese private company. What do you think the U.S. is asking for, and what might they be able to get?
Yeah, this is a terrific question, and it really goes to the points I just made. There seems to be a lot of emphasis on unwinding the subsidy structures that support state-owned enterprises or state-vested enterprises in China. For those of us who've been in China a long time, myself 31 years, the subsidy regime is so complex that it's almost impossible to know. In fact, I often wonder whether anyone knows, even on the Chinese side, the extent of subsidies that domestic firms receive or don't receive. Clearly, it's an issue. Ideally, it can be dealt with over time. But again, if the playing field was leveled, if U.S. and European firms were enabled to compete with state-owned enterprises in China unconditionally, this would mean that the government would have to continue to step up subsidies to a level that would ultimately be unsustainable vis-a-vis China's ongoing economic slowdown. So some of you may be familiar with our thesis on Chinese economic growth. We believe that China is amidst a deep structural downshift, what we call a long softfall in Chinese growth. This can only be corrected by reforms that restore productivity performance. SOEs in general, and not without some exceptions, are unproductive and underperforming. They're core businesses mostly, and in many cases are funded by non-core business in finance and real estate and other things. Again, if Western firms are able to compete head-to-head with these firms in China based on a negative list business license construct, this would mean that if the government wanted to maintain these SOEs in their position, they'd have to pump more and more and more money in to these SOEs, and sooner or later, this will become unsustainable economically. So our hope is that the U.S. negotiators aren't trying to deconstruct this in some administrative way, because again, it would be so hard to figure that out. I've even undertaken studies in this area in my career here in China, and with one sector or one company, it is so difficult to unpack all of the subsidies that they may receive. There are some obvious cases where companies are subsidized, and largely this can be identified under anti-dumping provisions where pricing is very obviously below market. But beyond that, if you try to look at tax preferences or factor endowments like land and utility costs or equity injections, it gets very, very complicated. Again, it's a hopeful long-term goal, but hopefully in the near term, the U.S. negotiators focus on the playing field issues that would, in essence, indirectly force a change or make subsidies so much more expensive than they are now that they would become unfeasible in the medium term for sure, and quite possibly in the near term.
Great.
So let's end this on a notion about what this all means in the meantime. So the U.S. and China are amidst this difficult negotiation. We don't know how it's going to play out. But what does that mean for multinationals in the meantime? And we have a meme here we'd like to introduce called Mind the Gaps. And the premise here is that the opportunity for multinationals in China primarily has always lay in the gap between the national targets, the national plan targets, and the indigenous capabilities necessary to achieve them. So we've seen this in the 13 five-year plans that have been introduced since 1978, that MNCs that align with the targets in the plan and work with their domestic partners and commercial relationships to achieve those plans, achieve market access, and generally several years of prosperity and significant returns on investment. The interesting thing about today's China is that the national plans, whether it's Belt and Road or Made in China 2025 or the mega cities or the new economy or the big data or the AI, all of these plans envision or aspire to leapfrogging to global prominence. So you could say that the national targets that have been set in China today, the gap between indigenous capabilities and the targets is wider than ever. Therefore, the need for multinational collaboration is greater than ever. This is the opportunity. Our China Center members reveal to us that they're enjoying more hospitality from their government regulators here in China than they have done for a long, long time. And in part, we think this reflects a fear that maybe these multinationals will begin to descale or exit. But more importantly, it reflects an interest in collaborating with these multinationals to assure that these key points in these national plans can be achieved. Finally, counterintuitively, the restrictions that are being imposed on multinationals, American multinationals and European multinationals with significant U.S. presence in the form of FIRMA, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, the last bullet point on the right, is actually helpful. It provides multinationals with a backstop to ring-fence their critical IP. This is so important. For those of you who know China well, you will know that in negotiating in new business areas with Chinese interlocutors or partners, there is always a difficult question about technology skills and know-how transfer. And it's an environment where the Chinese side has been in a very strong negotiating position by virtue of divide and conquer dynamics. If I don't accept, and for multinationals, it's been about who can give away less. A very difficult situation. The FIRMA Act actually helps stop this. What it means is that multinationals can say to their Chinese partners, we'd love to transfer these skills, we'd love to transfer this IP, but we can't. It's no longer permitted. It's backstopped. None of us can do it. This is the best we can do. It's a counterintuitive argument. We see evidence of it. We have firsthand knowledge that some multinationals are putting this negotiating lever to use. It's really something to think about going forward. So let me end today's webcast just by saying, reminding you about a few things. The presentation can be downloaded via the link provided on your page right now. There's a lot of material here, but it's only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the work we've produced on this topic and many other topics on on China that are related to it. Ethan and my emails are provided on page 3, I think. Please reach out to us with any questions, or if you'd like to continue the conversation. Conference board members, you can request briefings on this topic and more via our video conference facilities or in person if logistics permit. And non-members, if you're interested in a further discussion, we'd be delighted to do so. Just reach out and we can talk about U.S.-China relations and other work that we're doing here in China and in Asia. And we'd love to discuss prospects for having you join our program as well. So thank you very much for joining and have a nice day.